Good morning. My name is Anya Hart. I'm with the City of Poulsbo, and I'm going to be your moderator for Solutions to Stormwater Rate Challenges with Tage Aaker. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box, and then we will get to them after the presentation. So take it away, Tage.
Thank you, Anya. So my name is Tage Aaker. I'm a project manager with FCS Group. Been with the firm for about 10 years now, and we're headquartered out of Redmond, Washington. And besides stormwater utility rate studies, we do specialize in water, sewer, solid waste, and electric studies. So with that, we'll get to the agenda for today's presentation. We'll be given in 3 parts. Background and history will be very brief, and then the meat of the presentation will be those second main bullets, making a case for rate increases, and the second part is making a case for rate equity improvements. And we'll get into those in a little bit more detail in just a couple of slides. Did want to provide a brief background on the history of stormwater rates and how they have related to regulatory requirements. Formerly, low monthly rates did not generate a lot of interest in terms of how they were calculated, what the money was going towards. But as you all know, over the past 10, 15, 20 years, increased regulation and increased developer requirements have essentially led to a stronger focus and emphasis on how rates are calculated, are they equitable, and what types of rate credits might be offered. So part 1, the case for rate increases. Typically, we have a general approach when we're talking to elected officials or members of the public, and we'll try to explain the need. And this is where we work with city staff pretty closely to put together some slides, gather some pictures, but we definitely like to spend time on talking about those regulatory requirements. The NPDES Phase 2 measures are there off to the right. In addition to that, there's repair and maintenance, capital projects, it's the customer billing administration. So there's a lot that goes into stormwater utility, and it's always helpful, I think, to provide a little bit of background when we're also discussing potential rate increases. After we explain the need, we try to illustrate the case. We talk about rates, how they compare against general cost inflation, and how over time inflation can squeeze out some of that capital funding that may have been there 5 or 10 years ago, but now it's often the case that rates are barely able to cover operating costs. So we talk about strategies to communicate that need. And then we try to present solution options and what we're calling the level of service approach. I'm sure many of you have used this type of tool in communicating to your elected officials and members of the public. We often will recommend, and a lot of times cities already have a stormwater utility FAQ, but we found that services provided by the stormwater utilities are less tangible than water and sewer. You turn on the faucet, water comes out, you flush the toilet, wastewater goes away. It's pretty intuitive what you're able to get with your monthly bill. For stormwater, a lot of times we find that members of the public don't even know what stormwater is. They often will think it's just a tax on rain. So some sort of FAQ, bill stuffer on the website, using social media, what is stormwater? What does the stormwater utility do? How much money is being collected? What does it go towards? Those are all good things to cover in some type of public education pamphlet. When talking to elected officials about potential needs for rate increases, we found it helpful to briefly touch on some of the consequences of non-compliance. That could be third-party lawsuits, losing control of the NPDES permit, fines from ecology, not to mention risk to public safety if there's erosion issues or some type of sinkhole or collapsed pipe that aging infrastructure can pose. And then a lot of stormwater utilities are trying to maintain, keep up with growth while still maintaining strong water quality. So a lot of those elements that we talked about in the previous slides are more programmatic operating type expenses, but as many of you know, stormwater utilities are very capital intensive. So this is an example from the city of Newcastle where we highlighted their asset inventory at a fairly high level, 35 miles of pipe, over 100 ponds, tanks, and vaults, nearly 3,000 storm drains. Provided pictures in the presentation to City Council to help them, remind them what types of assets that we're trying to install, maintain, or repair. And I like this graphic here, kind of showing where those assets are in relation to the city limits there, kind of spread out all over. We found it pretty helpful to highlight recent successes. So if you have had stormwater rates pay for a high profile project or fix a particular issue, we found it very helpful to remind elected officials, members of the public, that this is one way that we're using those stormwater dollars to help and maintain our system. This was the city of Wenatchee. There was a pretty badly damaged pipe there. And so we wanted to highlight that just recently there were some efforts to put in a new pipe there and remind them of that project. Also important to highlight future infrastructure needs, not only what was recently addressed, but what needs to be addressed in the CIP, the Capital Improvement Program. This is an example from the city of Newcastle. They reviewed nearly 230 pipe segments and almost half had some form of structural deficit. So we included a couple of pictures in the council presentation to illustrate what types of issues are being seen and hopefully encourage them to provide funding for that rehabilitation program, the S38 CIP program. Not only that, for the city of Maple Valley, one of their particular projects was aiming to reduce flooding and improve water quality. And flooding is a very public-facing issue. And so we wanted to make sure to remind council that one of your capital projects is aiming to reduce a potentially chronic flooding issue. Oftentimes, we'll work with a utility that had rates in time, in this case, back in 2006, $87 per year. And maybe at that time, those rates were sufficient to cover operating and capital expenditures. But over time, there's cost inflation, new regulations, significant service increases required to serve new growth and development. And so what we wanted to show here, communicating in the public meeting, was that, look, the rates have not increased in nearly 14 years. If the city had been adjusting for inflation over time, little adjustments each year, that $87 would have been about $120 per year. So just kind of showing how that buying power decreases over time. And now it's time for a case study where we talk about the level of service tool. And this is for the city of Newcastle. And with the help of city staff, we put together 3 different levels of service: minimum, proactive, and optimum. And this is essentially providing a menu of options for the city council to consider. And by doing this, we were able to associate a certain level of service with a certain level of rate. And so if you were to adopt something less than the optimum level of service, there's potential service level cuts that would need to be addressed. So the minimum level of service is just that. It was the revenue required to fund the minimum requirements of the existing system, as well as the minimum NPDES compliance requirements. The proactive level of service not only funded the minimum level of service, but incorporated some high priority projects and programs to further address water quality and regulatory requirements that were anticipated for the future. And the optimum level of service funded both minimum and proactive components, but added additional priority projects and programs to further enhance water quality and further enable funding for more proactive maintenance. In a different way, we're still showing those 3 levels of service. We wanted to note here that all 3 levels of service funded the operating budget. All 3 levels of service funded a couple of key projects and programs, and where the differences began were in the proactive level of service. We incorporated an additional $100,000 per year for that rehab program. You might recall the CCTV pipe pictures that we had a couple of slides ago, and also incorporated an additional project there. The optimum level of service added an additional $100,000 per year for that rehab program and a few other select priority projects and programs. So this was an effective way to communicate to the City Council that there are different programs and capital projects that you get under each level of service. And so if you choose a rate that is for proactive, for example, you may not have the funding for these particular projects or programs under the optimum level of service. So that's in table format. We have a slide coming up here that shows the capital projects funded under each level of service. Again, keeping with that color coordination there, with purple as the minimum level of service, blue as a proactive level of service, and that green color there for the optimum level of service. We just wanted to communicate how much capital each level of service was funding and when that capital expense might occur. So proactive level of service, for example, was not slated to begin until 2022. And we know some people like the details, so we did include a few informational slides to show the exact project or program, the cost, and the year that we expected that expenditure to hit the stormwater utility. So we have all of those purple projects there for the minimum level of service. Added on top of that was additional funding for the rehab conveyance program and the S40 Lancaster water quality project, while still funding that minimum level of service as well. And then in the next slide here, we show the optimum level of service to detail what projects and when would be funded under the optimum level of service. And then we got into the rate impacts. At the bottom there, we do show the percentage rate increases. So for the minimum level of service, it would have required a 6% rate increase in 2021, 3% per year after that. The proactive level of service funded $2 million more in capital, but would require 9.5% rate increase in 2021 and 9.5% rate increase in 2022. The optimum level of service would require 13.5% rate increases in 2021 and 2022, but would fund the full CIP $10 million worth. Now, we did include the percentages there, but we tried to focus on the dollar impacts. So for the minimum level of service, the 6% rate increase equated to about $1.50 per month in 2021. The 9.5% rate increase for the proactive level of service equated to $2.25 per month in 2021 and 2022, whereas the optimum level of service, 13.5%, that equated to about $3.50 per month. So providing the percentage and the dollar impacts there provided some context. Sometimes the percentages can look a little bit more scary than the dollar impact on a monthly basis. So that's the case for rate increases. And oftentimes when you're looking at rate increases, it can be a good time to evaluate, do we have a good rate structure in place? Is it fair? And what about rate credits? So this is a common stormwater rate structure that we see in Washington. Typical residential single-family home would pay a fixed amount per year, in this case, billed on the annual property tax statement. And everybody else, depending on your percentage impervious surface, would pay a light or moderate all the way on up to very heavy rate per acre. So it breaks up the commercial multifamily into these density tiers. So if you're 25% impervious, you have a commercial property, you'd fall in that moderate tier there and pay per acre $421 per year. There's a couple of issues with this type of structure. There's inequities at the tier edges and then inequities within the tiers themselves. And we do provide a couple of examples here on the next couple of slides. You can have a case where similar customers are paying different rates. So for example, parcel A and parcel B have very similar amounts of impervious area, but because that slight addition in impervious area bumped parcel B up into the moderate rate category, they're paying nearly double parcel A, despite having only 400 more impervious square feet. 5% increase in impervious coverage, but nearly doubling the annual charge. Conversely, you can have dissimilar customers paying the same rate. So again, we have parcel B in the moderate rate tier, 9,100 impervious square feet. They're paying $421 per year. Parcel C also paying $421 per year, but the impervious coverage is nearly double that of parcel B, 19,600 impervious square feet compared to 9,000 impervious square feet. So here we show graphically what that looks like in terms of graphing that rate structure. You have impervious square feet on a 1 acre parcel here at the bottom, and you have the annual charge on the vertical axis here. And these are essentially the different density tiers. And so there's example one, that jump at the tier edges. If you just have a little bit of additional impervious area, that might bump you up into the next tier. Well, you can go from essentially 10,000 impervious square feet up to 20,000 impervious square feet with no change in the tier and therefore no change in the rate. So one way to address this type of inequity is to consider the equivalent service unit approach. We refer to that as the ESU approach, where the rate is expressed in $1 per ESU. Would be no change to single family customers, would be basically 1 ESU per 1 single family developed parcel. Regardless of impervious area, it's a uniform rate. Now everybody else, you would take the measured impervious area, you would divide by 3,500 square feet in this example for this particular city, and that would give you a number of ESUs. 3,500 impervious square feet was the average impervious area on a single family developed parcel. And so what this does, it eliminates the density tiers, the percent coverage, it doesn't matter. The key takeaway is that impervious area matters, not necessarily the percent coverage. So hearkening back to that graphic where we have the stair-step approach of the density structure here, we overlay that with the ESU structure in the dashed light blue line, where as you have more impervious area on a parcel, the charge goes up proportionately. There's no ups and downs as you jump between tiers. So that's one type of approach to, if you have that density type of rate structure, you may want to consider evaluating whether an ESU structure would make sense for your stormwater utility. Another way to look at the equity of your rate structure is whether or not you should be providing rate credits. This comes up quite a bit, and sometimes, we want to mention here, you got to be careful of overly generous credit programs. We've worked with some cities and even a county or two that had rate credits 70, 80, sometimes 90%. And as you all know, many of the stormwater utilities costs do not decrease no matter what is done on site. So one approach would be to take your stormwater utility costs, allocate them between base and use costs. So for example, base costs are those types of costs that generally don't change with varying levels of on-site mitigation. So this could be customer billing, education and outreach, some portion of permit compliance. Those typically would not be eligible for a rate credit. It's those use costs. And these are, things such as facility maintenance, and there are types of costs that are generally more likely to vary depending on the on-site mitigation of a particular parcel. those maintenance or water volume or water quality type costs, those could be the basis for rate credits. And when we've done these types of analyses, we typically find that maybe 30 or 40% of your costs might be eligible for a credit, but certainly not 70 or 80%. And that concludes the rate credit discussion. And we just have a couple of slides here in conclusion. One question that might be worth asking is, when's the last time that you looked at your customer billing system and performed an audit? And what we mean by that is, have you adequately captured changes in development? Could be new growth, could be redevelopment, densification of development. And sometimes you might find that you have parcels within the city limits that are not being built at all, despite them being developed, having impervious area. One common example is this, parking lots, for example, or a park and ride. They may not have water and sewer service, but they sure have a heck of a lot of impervious area and likely should be receiving a stormwater bill. So that's one thing that, every few years it could be worth spending the time to kind of go through your parcels to see if there's any missing pieces there. And then another topic that comes up quite a bit, especially for growing stormwater utilities with a lot of population growth, is general facilities charges, sometimes referred to as system development charges. These are very common for water and sewer utilities, not as common for stormwater utilities, but becoming more popular. They are legal, and these are one-time charges, not these monthly or annual service rates, and they're paid at the time of development, essentially providing revenue for capital projects as the growth occurs. We also wanted to provide a brief stormwater rate survey. We have Western Washington cities on the right-hand side and Eastern Washington cities on the left-hand side. What you can see is, overall Eastern Washington stormwater utility rates on a monthly basis are in the $5 to $10 range, quite a bit lower than Western Washington, where it's uncommon to see a monthly stormwater rate under $10 per month. And we've seen just recently, even typical monthly stormwater fee might be somewhere in the $15 to $20 per month. In some cases, pushing $25 or over $30 per month. And that's where customers start to ask more about, okay, what is the stormwater utility? What services does it provide? Am I doing anything that might qualify for a rate credit? You might start to get more of those questions as those program costs increase, and therefore rates would need to increase to cover those costs. So in summary, when making the case for rate increase, it really helps to take the time to explain the need. This might be the case where even before you talk about rate adjustments and the finances, it could be a completely separate meeting prior to that financial discussion to basically say, here's the stormwater utility, here's the adopted capital improvement program, here's the different things we need to do to comply with federal and state regulations. We have operating costs, we have capital costs, kind of laying that out and then talking about, okay, here's how much revenue we're bringing in the door today. There's a potential gap here in future years. And to alleviate that gap, we would suggest, X and Y rate adjustments to continue to comply with permits and to continue to execute the capital program. Pictures, we think, are very important to kind of highlight recent successes, maybe current issues with existing infrastructure, maybe flooding issues can really help explain what the stormwater utility is trying to do. And then, of course, providing a level of service matrix or some sort of set of scenarios that help provide elected officials with a menu of options so they can sort of pick and choose different service levels and see what that rate impact might be. And then while you're doing that, it could be a really important time to look at the equity of utility rates. That's both the rate structure and potentially rate credits. So with that, concludes the presentation. Any questions, Anya, that have come up?
So it looks like Anya's computer froze, so I'm going to help with Q&A during this
Oh, no.
portion. Well,
Thanks, Alyssa.
technology, we love it.
That's right.
Absolutely. Okay, so it looks like we do have one question. Should a credit be approximately equal to the amount of annual maintenance performed?
Is that on a particular parcel? And I'll probably start by saying that besides a 10% permissive rainwater harvesting credit, a stormwater utility is not generally obligated to offer any sort of rate credits at all. And should be some sort of discussion on what types of activities would qualify for a rate credit. Would you qualify for a rate credit if you're just meeting development requirements? Or would you only qualify for a rate credit if you exceed development requirements? Is it offered only for commercial and multifamily customers? What about single family customers? So there's a lot of policy questions to consider when evaluating a credit program. But did you get a clarification on that question there?
Didn't. Ken, if you want to chat as a clarification, we're going to hop to the next one. Looks like Anya was able to join us. I'm going to let Anya answer the next few. We do only have about 4 minutes though. So Anya, go ahead and take the next one from, looks like Nels.
Okay. Are there studies available of ESU versus square foot impervious equivalencies to reference in proposing adjusting the ESU to square feet relationship for our utility?
That's a good question. We would recommend looking at a sample of single family parcels within your jurisdiction to come up with an exact number. For example, this is one that we had done in conjunction with the study, and we looked at over 150 developed single family parcels. Some significant variance there, but by doing that, you can come up with a median or average to base your ESU on that's tailored for your particular city and age of those parcels.
Thank you. When talking inequities, do you have recommendations regarding a more equitable residential rate fee to account for the amount of impervious surface or stormwater generated rather than a flat residential rate?
Yeah, that's a good question. It all comes down to balancing administrative effort and equity. It's certainly most common and defensible to have a uniform flat residential rate. More cities are considering some sort of tiered residential structure, maybe a small, medium, and large, for example, but that might require that you measure all the single family parcels within the city. And that could be a significant effort of staff time to come up with those numbers and maintain them over time. So it's kind of balancing, okay, we can get a little bit more fine-tuned, but it may take additional effort on an ongoing basis to maintain that type of structure. But I think there's a couple of cities in Western Washington that have some sort of small, medium, large. I think Milton and Des Moines, I think, has a residential structure that's tiered like that.
Thank you. So we're just about out of time. I'll try to ask a quick question here. In terms of rate changes, stormwater connection charges and rate credits seem like kind of icing on the cake, maybe, certainly part of the whole thing, but it sounds like maybe those don't always have to come always together as a strategy, and hopefully we won't be cut off in your answer. Go ahead, Tage.
Yeah, that's a good point. You could look at all those things at once, or you could look at them sort of one at a time. I think, if you're balancing, paying your bills versus getting a little bit more equity in your rate structure, you might find that the priority is just to get enough revenue in the door to pay your expenses. But once you're at a good point revenue-wise, covering your costs, it could then be the next step to look at your rate structure and rate credit program. Certainly do not have to do all of those at the same time.
Thank you, Tage. We're about to end, so thank you everybody for attending. You can contact Tage at the information on your screen or that is in your Municon program. Thanks, everybody. Thanks again, Tage. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.